Welcome back to the archives for round 4 of the National Open. In this round I had the black pieces against Tang, and I was able to do some research beforehand, so I had a good idea of what to expect out of the opening. We got a Najdorf, and my opponent plays bishop e2, and they played the king h1 line. So I knew this beforehand, and I had knight to c6 prepared. I didn't really know where the game was going to go after this. It had a lot of branches possible, and I didn't see a lot of games where they had played against knight to c6. They played f4, which was normal, and I played rook to e8, a waiting move. I don't want to capture on f4 because that'll allow them to just develop their bishop for free. And they played queen to e1. I wasn't ready for this. I figured it was probably a mistake, but I didn't have an idea how to punish it. So I thought for a little bit, and I think I tried too hard to punish it. Maybe a move like b5 or bishop d7 or queen c7, something like that would be fine here. But I jumped in with my knight with dual threats. I'm attacking c2, threatening the fork, and also if they capture my knight, I'll take back and we're going to be winning the e4 pawn. However, my opponent has the move bishop to d3, which deals with both of those threats at once, guarding e4 and guarding c2. I played b5 because I didn't want to back my knight up, so I figured I'd take a worse pawn structure and play for activity. And that's exactly what happens here. I guard the pawn, he attacks the pawn again, and I play d5. So I'm offering to sack a pawn or two in order to get my bishops active and try and play against their king, which is the more exposed king in this position. So even though they played king h1 and want to play on the king side, my king's still feeling perfectly safe. So I played d5, which was a move I was pretty happy with. And they played e5, and we get this expected position. When my opponent takes with the queen, I capture back with the bishop. And this was a really interesting position. I thought that they could take this pawn, but probably wouldn't. And they thought for a long time here. And in fact, if they do take this pawn, black plays bishop to b7 and has a nice little advantage. Nothing huge, like -1, but I would have been happy with it. 2 active bishops, and they decided that they didn't want any of that, and they played queen to c3. And then I played bishop to f2, another move in this game that I was quite proud of, the idea being that the bishop cannot be taken, or they will lose the exchange, and I'm guarding that g3 square. I thought there were a lot of chances where I might be able to get some kind of checkmate going on the h file. They play knight to g3, and no checkmates quite work out because they're always going to be able to play this f5 move in and guard h6, but the knight didn't seem extremely scary there, and now I hit the queen, and I'm able to solidify my bishop on the f2 square. And I thought in this position that they were likely going to have to give up the exchange. But I didn't know how to increase the pressure, so I thought for a long time in this position and thought about a lot of different moves. I considered playing a5 and just letting them sacrifice the exchange. I considered moving my bishop to d7 and trying to get to the b5 square, winning the exchange. I considered playing h5. And h5, I wasn't sure it works. It turns out h5 is just a really nice move in this position. But it was on my radar. Couldn't quite make it work. Kind of reminds me of the a4 move that I played in round 1. So if you haven't watched the other rounds, I suggest going back and doing so. Lots of interesting games. But we had a position there where I sacrificed a pawn and then the exchange. Here, sacrificing the pawn to open things up would have been good. I thought about bishop to e6, and eventually I decided on bishop to b7, thinking that I would be able to play queen to c6 and get something along this diagonal. And after bishop b7, I expected them to sacrifice the exchange, and it's a reasonable position for both people. I liked my chances. What I missed was that bishop b7 was the only move out of all of my suggestions that undefended the f5 square. And as a result, after bishop b7, my opponent found the nice resource knight f5. Now I don't have any threats of taking on g3. Now I have my pawn under attack more than once, 3 times in fact. And queen to c6 doesn't work because when they capture back on the e3 square, they're also preventing the checkmate. And unfortunately, bishop takes g2 also doesn't work. They capture back, and there's not quite enough of a threat here with the queen being able to defend, and their king going to be safe on h3 at some point. So I can't sacrifice the bishop either. So this was an oversight by me, definitely what I would consider my biggest mistake of the game. Have a real nice position here, but I needed a quiet move that didn't make my position worse, and I found a move that did, in fact, make the position worse. So after bishop to b7 and knight f5, I think I'm actually in some trouble. So I still go queen c6, create the threat. They capture, we trade, and I bring the next rook in. And at this point, I was feeling a bit demoralized because I'm down 2 pawns already, and I didn't see a way to really create activity. And unlike in an earlier round where I was confident I could draw the opposite colored bishop endgame, here I have very little to no confidence in it because there is going to be a majority for them on both sides of the board. And so it's going to be very challenging for my bishop to play against an extra pawn on both sides. So I felt like I had to avoid the endgame here. And so I lift my rook. And then I decide here that I need to open the position up further. Didn't see a good way to make progress, so I play h5. A little bit late, but still a reasonable move. And my opponent took it pretty fast. I was surprised. I thought they might think for a while, but maybe it's kind of scary to let this pawn run up the board. So they captured, I attacked, and then I found this creative move, rook to h3. And when I played rook to h3, I thought that I had some real chances again because we have a lot of threats going on right now. Even more threats than I appreciated at the time. I created extra threats I wasn't even aware of. And my opponent didn't take super long on their move, but they did find one of the best moves in the position. So in this position, what would you play if you had the white pieces? So let's flip it around. You can pause the video if you want. What would you play to defend this position? Realizing that there are going to be threats possibly against the bishop, g2, h2. How do you keep everything safe? In the game, my opponent played the move king to g1, which indeed keeps everything safe and shuts down most of my play. So credit to them for finding that move. The other move you can play here is f5. So if you were thinking f5 to defend the h6 pawn, well done again. You've also been able to defend the position. But now some moves that look tempting, but actually just lose. Queen to d3. Loses to queen to h6. There's no way that white is going to be able to defend the attack down the h-file. There is rook to f3. Which fails to, queen captures, bishop captures, and we're up in exchange. And then there is also queen to d2, which fails to queen h6. And there's rook to g1, which actually just leads to a maiden 4. No way to stop checkmate after queen to h6. So a lot of threats here, but my opponent was able to navigate them. Queen to f1 is another idea, but that just blunders the bishop. So in the end, king to g1 and f5 are the two moves that save white's position. And they played king to g1, and now I really don't have a ton of play in the position. So I'll show you the rest of the game because my opponent did a good job of converting it, but I'm simply down 3 pawns at this point. So they force the queens off. I try and get the second rook involved. And then they play f5. My bishop can't capture because it's defended by the rook. And once my rook moves, they can just play f6 and attack the pinned pawn. They can bring the second rook in. So my opponent played well. It was an interesting game. It was a fun game. I really liked my position out of the opening, sacrificing the pawn. So I was happy with it. The only move I wasn't really happy with was bishop to b7 because I squandered that good position. But I was pretty proud of a couple of the different ideas and that my prep paid off, at least in terms of getting a good position. So this is now my second loss of the tournament. I'm sitting at 1.5 out of 4, halfway through the third day of play. So I'm hoping to turn things around and do better in the evening game. So stay tuned for round 5 of the National Open in the next video. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Good luck in your games and your studies, and I'll see you next time.